Our closing speaker is the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, W. Richard West, better known to most of us as Rick West, and now the president and CEO of the Autry National Center of the American West. Rick?
Thank you very much, Patricia. I want to begin with a story about my first meeting with Senator Inouye as the director of the National Museum of the American Indian almost a quarter century ago in 1990, shortly after I had been appointed in June of that year. I had met and gotten to know the senator, of course, during my 2 decades as an attorney and lobbyist in the law firm of Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, representing American Indian tribal clients that stretch from New York to Arizona and Florida to Alaska. But that meeting with him in 1990 as the novitiate director was an entirely different matter. I was sitting at the feet, literally and figuratively, of the very father of the congressional effort to establish the NMAI. I had to be on absolutely my best behavior, and the margins for error were de minimis in my own mind. The senator was as he always was. He was serious, he was thoughtful, he was eloquent. Our conversation ranged widely over the subjects I would have expected it to. They included his lengthy involvement with the authorization of the NMAI, his lofty hopes for the institution, and the specific focus on repatriation and what needed to be done there. He then asked me numerous questions relating to these topics and more, and I answered them with every ounce of intelligence and articulateness I could muster. As the meeting eventually drew to a close, we all stood up to make our goodbyes. At that point, I dared to hope that I had emerged from the conversation with no major or obvious gaffes or damage. But then the senator looked at me with a pleasant enough smile and said, "But I have one more thing to ask. And perhaps we should have that conversation more privately over there for just a moment before you go." My heart sank as I thought, dear God, I have said something so far off that he needs to pull me aside for correction in order to avoid embarrassing me in front of all the rest of the people at this meeting. So we moved to the side, and by that time I am breaking into a cold sweat. He then puts his left hand gently on my arm, and with that luminous smile of his says, "I forgot to ask you the most important question on my mind for much of our visit." I'm practically stammering at this point, but managed to squeak out, "Of course, Senator, what might that be?" And without missing a beat, still smiling broadly, and I could swear with a wink, the nattiest dresser in the United States Senate leaned over and almost whispered, "Who makes your suits?" And in an instant and with an almost audible sigh of relief, I knew that I had been in the presence not only of the father of the NMAI, but also a genuinely warm and personable human being, and one possessed of a remarkably clever yet gracious sense of humor. But now to the topic I've been asked to address, defining and shaping the legacy for the future. How does one even begin to address a question that demands an answer as broad and deep as the man who created the legacy? I begin with a healthy dose of humility. That task is probably beyond the reach of most human beings, including me. In addition, you already have heard a wealth of presentations today that address both the past and the future of Senator Inouye's legacy with respect to a full range of issues, past, present, and future, that affect our community. Tribal sovereignty, issues of sovereignty and governance, education, and healthcare. So let me suggest how I would like to approach what Kevin and Patricia have asked me to do. First, I want to look at the future of his legacy more in terms of the public values and aspects of personal character that motivated and shaped him the entirety of his distinguished public career and the vast substance that he brought in public life to Indian country. The flight from Los Angeles, where I now live, to Washington, D.C. is long, and I loaded myself up with things to read in addition to my own personal experience with Senator Inouye. What I found was a remarkable consistency of values and character through time that should inspire all of us, native and non-native alike, as we look to the future and perpetuate his profound substantive legacy. Second, I want to turn to one specific aspect of his legacy in Native America in the form of the National Museum of the American Indian and all that it embodied and personified, namely the concept and ethic, indeed the moral imperative, of the preservation, the continuance, the survivance of Native cultures and peoples. I am fully respectful that my two lifelong friends and colleagues, Patricia Zell, a current trustee of the NMAI, and my fellow Oklahoman and former law partner Kevin Gover, discussed the NMAI earlier today. But my special twist on the subject is how perfectly this special place where we have gathered today, this potent and permanent emblem of Native cultural heritage and continuance, reflects the enduring values and character of Senator Daniel K. Inouye. So let me turn first to those markers of character that for me so grounded and shaped the public life and legacy of Senator Inouye. And there are four of them I wish to discuss and emphasize here today. The first is well known to many, if not all of us, his immense personal courage, which reflected itself initially in theaters of war. He was, by any measure we can devise, a hero in World War II as a member of the famed Autry 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In 1945, he was grievously wounded while leading an assault on a heavily defended ridge near Santorenzo in Tuscany, in that region of Italy, where his only comment, even as his troops hovered over their commander while he was being carried away on a litter, was a pointed order to get back to their positions because, quote, nobody called off the war, close quote. For extreme bravery in this action, he was initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross that later was upgraded to the Medal of Honor by President Clinton. The same personal courage he demonstrated on military fields of battle was plainly evident following World War II, when Inouye became active in the Democratic Party in Hawaii and pursued a career in elective office. He fought hard to end the domination of politics there by the Big Five sugar companies and to secure the participation of Hawaii's non-white majority in the political life and processes what was then the territory of Hawaii. After serving in the territorial legislature, he became the U.S. representative from the new state of Hawaii in 1959, when it entered the Union. And the rest is history. In 1962, he was elected to a vacant seat in the United States Senate, which he held until his death. The longest-serving United States senator in history, save one, his close friend, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Along the way, he actively supported the federal civil rights legislation proposed by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson that helped ensure, in part, that the political processes of this country be open to all of its citizenry. The second element of Senator Inouye's character that drove everything he did in public life is actually an associated collection of several. The senator had a deep and abiding commitment to integrity in public institutions, an insistence on the morality of how those elected to lead the nation and serve it should behave, an unfailing sensibility of separating right from wrong in public life. That strong center of gravity morally was in clear evidence on numerous occasions throughout his career in the United States Senate. In 1973, he served with great distinction as a member of the Senate's Watergate Committee appointed to investigate the illegal activities in Richard M. Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. The members of the committee and the public valued his patient but persistent and insistent questioning of Nixon's former Attorney General and private aides. But his complete outrage at their violations of the public trust sometimes could not help bubbling to the top, such as when he whispered, "What a liar," into a hearing room microphone that turned out to be hot. Under President Carter's administration in 1976, after revelations of an abuse of power by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and other agencies, Senator Inouye was appointed chair of the Senate Committee on Intelligence. Under his leadership, the committee developed an entire new regime for the gathering of intelligence by the United States. It safeguarded the rights of American citizens in a variety of ways and required the President of the United States to certify explicitly that covert actions were necessary for national security before they could occur. That reputation for rigorous public integrity led to his selection a decade later as the chair of the Senate committee appointed to investigate what we know now as the Iran-Contra affair. There, the committee confirmed that a number of very high-ranking American officials had acted in direct violation of President Reagan's stated policies and the will of the United States Congress in selling weapons secretly to Iran and then siphoning off the profits to support rebels fighting a left-wing government in South America. With little hesitation, those accused often wrapped themselves in the American flag, arguing that they were only staunch patriots and justifying their illegal actions as essential to national survival in a hostile and dangerous world. Senator Inouye was having none of it and dismissed the justification outright. That is an excuse for autocracy, not policy, said the senator. Vigilance abroad does not require us to abandon our ideals or the rule of law at home. On the contrary, without our principles and without our ideals, we have little that is special or worthy to defend. And the third aspect of Senator Inouye's public character that I found so appealing and valuable, notwithstanding his obvious unflinching commitment to truth-telling and rigor in public integrity, he possessed in an abundance what I find today so painfully and completely absent in the behavior and action of our neighbors today to the immediate east of NMAI and up to the top of that hill. The characteristic is so out of vogue right now that it seems almost quaint to even mention the term any longer, but we should, because the nation needs it desperately at the moment. The word is civility, a simple concept, but its utter absence from this country's political discourse is crippling us in ways that can only be described as disabling and devastating for a great democracy. Senator Inouye was a cardinal member of that what apparently is a dying political breed on Capitol Hill, namely those legislators who work every day, collaboratively and collegially, with a political opposition to accomplish the nation's business. As his close friend, fellow senator, and former majority leader of the Senate, Bob Dole, once remarked, never once do I recall his being critical of another colleague, Republican or Democrat. To the end of collective legislative achievement in 2005, Inouye was an active member of a bipartisan group of 14 moderate senators known as the Gang of 14 that put in place a compromise regarding the use of filibusters to halt judicial appointments, a compromise that, tellingly, collapsed within this past year. The fourth and final element of Senator Inouye's character and value system in public life that I want to cite, and it relates closely to the third that I just discussed, is his impulse ultimately to act in ways that healed and reconciled. I often reflect on both his gallantry as a soldier defending his country in World War II and his efforts after the war was won to restore human and national connections between those who formerly had been enemies. Early in his political career in the 1960s, he moved to establish the first bilateral parliamentary exchange program with Japan. He supported diligently the efforts of Irene Hirano Inouye, his wife and my dear friend and colleague in the museum world and on the Ford Foundation Board of Trustees, to establish the U.S.-Japan Council in 2009 for the purpose of promoting relations between the two countries. He was pivotal in creating the East-West Center in Hawaii in 1960, a publicly funded and major policy center for relations and economic development between the United States and Asia. Of course, the interests obviously linked to the senator's own ethnic heritage, but it was far more than that. He had an abiding natural instinct to heal and reconcile where enmity and separation between nations and peoples existed before. Let me now turn, as promised, to the second part of my presentation, After almost 18 years as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, I came away with a deep and resolute appreciation and gratitude for how much this institution reflected during its first 2 decades of institutional formation, in which the senator played such an integral and undeniable role, those attributes of his character that I just finished describing. I understand, of course, that the senator would never have claimed more, that this institution and its bedrock commitment to Native cultural self-determination and continuance had its origins in the collective soul and heart of Native America, and in the life work of individuals like Suzanne Shown Harjo, Vine Deloria Jr., and Julie Johnson Kidd, who along with others oversaw the specific creation of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. But it was precisely because of his willingness to listen and to hear these first voices that Senator Inouye became such a powerful and effective advocate for our place on the National Mall. I want to offer 2 observations that connect the core character values of the senator to how he saw the National Museum of the American Indian in my own mind. First, the cultural pivot point of the NMAI, its instigating and transcendent value, was that part of the 1989 authorizing legislation which at long last addressed the issue of repatriation after the American museum community's living in denial for decades. The senator understood as much, even if it took the Smithsonian, not me, I emphasize, a while to get the same point. The senator was morally outraged and said so explicitly, that the remains of Native ancestors sat in the Smithsonian numbering well into the 5 digits. Moreover, he appreciated that no healing, let alone cultural reconciliation, was possible between those who were here and those who came until this vast wrong was corrected and itself buried as a matter of American cultural history. While many inside and outside the museum community, even after a quarter century of repatriation, still do not fully comprehend, is that the legislation was far larger and more impactful than its literal provisions. It was, of course, about the return of the remains of ancestors, sacred objects, and cultural patrimony. Those provisions are the fundamental underpinnings of a national, historic, and seminal cultural and moral correction. But they were the tip of the iceberg and metaphor for far more extensive and systemic changes in museum practices and in national cultural perceptions of Native America. First, the legislation provoked and stimulated an immense and enduring power shift in museums that extended beyond the return of objects and confirmed the authenticity and authority of Native communities as legitimate interpretive voices and necessary collaborators in matters of museum programming, research, and publications. This seismic shift turned previous museum practice quite literally on its head, where for a century such decisions had been solely the responsibility of the cultural priests who sat within the walls of the museum as the temple on the hill. Second, this shift breached the 4 walls of the museum and became part of the larger American cultural discourse. I can still recall, which the NMAI will be celebrating this coming fall, as it should, that remarkable and brilliant September day of golden sun and blue sky when the doors of this native place on the National Mall opened to the public for the first time. In that procession of 30,000 Native people from the 4 corners of the Americas down the mall, with thousands of their best non-Native friends also in tow, a symbolic moment of Native cultural potency occurred that will not be soon repeated. There the NMAI was, a physical cultural emblem of those who were here, sitting directly across the National Mall in equality, from the very symbol and cultural apotheosis of those who came, the East Wing of the National Gallery. My second point in linking the character and viewpoint of the senator to the form and substance of the NMAI was more evolutionary. As many of you know, initially his aspiration was to erect, in a form he was accustomed to as precedent in analogous situations, a memorial associated with a reburial of the native remains that occupied shelf after shelf at the Smithsonian. But again, he listened, understood, and acted upon native voices, eventually settling on a different model of resolution and institution, one that sat far closer in form to a museum and cultural center. He did so, and this based, in my view, upon some of the direct conversations he and I had over the years, because in listening to the Native community, it is a living institution of Native culture that, in the end, is the most appropriate, something that looked forward with the same intense focus that it applied retrospectively. And a third and final point that derives directly from what I said about Senator Inouye earlier in my presentation. From time to time, the senator and I, almost always with Patricia Zell and often with Suzanne Harjo and Pablita Abeta, would meet in the senator's office in the Capitol building itself. Such meetings were always a very special treat because the front window of that office looked directly over the site of the NMAI on the National Mall. The specific occasion I am recalling now was important for a variety of reasons, not all of them uplifting. The NMAI's architectural design process was extremely challenging and complicated for a variety of reasons. And one side of the Congress had failed to make the annual appropriation for the Cultural Resources Center of the NMAI, located in Suitland, Maryland, threatening quite literally its progress in construction. I was probably in a relatively crestfallen mood at that time, and it often prompted special warmth in the form of comfort from the senator that I so valued personally through the years. It was such a fine human response and gesture. The senator first explained in very practical terms that he had reached across the political aisle, as he did so effectively, to his friend and colleague, the late Senator Ted Stevens, and asked to take just a bit of appropriation from the budget of the Department of Defense to straighten out our annual appropriation for the construction of the CRC. The initiative of the U.S. Air Force, he told me with a smile and a nod, to support Native culture. But he also talked, as we looked down at the mall site, of the need for patience and persistence, that nothing important and change-making or transformational comes easily, that I, like him, always should take the long view of history and what all of us together were trying to do to create a Native place and to heal cultural wounds that had been so long in place in order to achieve a much-needed and true cultural reconciliation. It was a big message from a big man with a large heart, and I always did my best to honor and live by it. Senator Inouye left all of us in the Native community a vast substantive legacy. But what I have tried to say today in both parts of my presentation is that the immense value of his legacy for the future is also in the intangible rather than the tangible, in the spirit and character that motivated this remarkable public citizen to do what he did through an entire lifetime. Perhaps what I have attempted to describe was more eloquently captured by Robert F. Kennedy when he said, in contemplating America's future, there are those who look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. We love this man, Senator Daniel K. Inouye. We loved who he was as a human being, and we loved what he did as a public citizen. And today, and on this occasion, we should remember and celebrate, in the spirit of the giveaway, that he too loved us. Thank you.